A vampire king saw his maid sleeping on the street. Then he did the unthinkable. "You look like you are waiting for the winter to take you," a voice murmured, cutting through the howl of the Rosehaven wind. It was a voice like velvet over crushed glass, ancient, cold, and impossibly beautiful. Estelle Stonewell didn't open her eyes. Her lashes were frozen shut by tears and sleet. "Let it," she whispered, her breath a ghost of a thing in the midnight air. "It is the only thing in this city that asks for nothing in return." A shadow fell over her, deeper than the night, and the world suddenly went still. The city of Rosehaven was a masterpiece of Gothic cruelty. Its spires reached for the throat of heaven like jagged obsidian teeth, and its streets were paved with the broken dreams of the living. For Estelle Stonewell, the city had been a silent executioner. 3 months ago, she had been the head maid at the Mistwood Manor, a position that promised safety, a warm hearth, and a steady wage. But the world of the nobility was a fickle sea, and she had been cast overboard when she refused the advances of a visiting lord. Now she was nothing, a shadow among shadows. The snow fell in heavy, wet flakes that clung to her threadbare wool shawl. Her fingers were no longer numb, they were simply gone, lost to a dull, aching void. She sat huddled in the alcove of a boarded-up bakery on the street of weavers, her back against the cold stone. She had tried to find work at the taverns, the laundries, even the coal yards, but Rosehaven was a city that smelled weakness. Once you were down, the iron-shod boots of the wealthy simply stepped over you. "Move along, girl," a watchman had told her an hour ago, his halberd gleaming under the dim gaslight. He didn't even look at her face. To him, she was just another piece of urban refuse to be swept into the gutters. Estelle tucked her chin into her chest, trying to preserve the last flickering ember of warmth in her lungs. She thought of her mother's kitchen, the smell of rosemary and baked bread, the way the sunlight used to pool on the pine floorboards. It felt like a story she had read in a book once, a life that belonged to someone else. Across the street, the elite of Rosehaven were beginning to emerge from the Grand Opera. Carriages pulled by midnight black horses thundered over the cobblestones, splashing slush onto the sidewalks. The women were wrapped in furs that cost more than Estelle's father had made in a decade. The men wore silk hats and carried canes topped with silver wolves. They were the high bloods, the descendants of the ancient families who had made a pact with the night. She watched them through half-lidded eyes. They were so vibrant, so full of heat. To them, the cold was merely a temporary inconvenience between the theatre and the ballroom. To her, it was the end of the world. Her stomach cramped, a sharp, twisting reminder that she hadn't eaten in 2 days. The hunger had been a screaming beast at first, but now it was just a dull, hollow echo. She felt light, as if her soul was slowly detaching from the heavy, frozen weight of her body. Is this how it ends? She wondered. In the mud, under the gaze of a city that never cared? A particularly violent gust of wind tore at her shawl, exposing her neck to the biting frost. She shivered, a convulsion that shook her entire frame, and then she went still. The exhaustion was winning. The darkness at the edges of her vision wasn't just the night. It was the invitation of sleep, the kind of sleep you didn't wake up from. She closed her eyes, letting her head rest against the rough granite of the bakery wall. The sounds of the city, the distant clatter of hooves, the muffled laughter of the rich, the whistling wind, began to fade into a rhythmic thrum, like a heartbeat. But then, the thrumming stopped. The air around her changed. The wind didn't cease, but it seemed to lose its bite. A strange metallic scent filled the air, not the smell of the coal-choked city, but something deeper. It smelled of ozone, of ancient cedar forests, and of something sharply sweet, like pomegranate wine. A pair of boots appeared in the periphery of her blurred vision. They weren't the scuffed leather of a watchman or the polished calf skin of a merchant. These were tall, structured boots of a dark, supple leather, accented with buckles of blackened silver. Estelle didn't look up. She didn't have the strength. "Rosehaven is unkind to its beauties," a voice said. It was the voice from her vision, the one that sounded like velvet and glass. She managed to crack one eye open. Standing before her was a man who seemed to be carved from the very shadows of the alley. He was tall, dressed in a long, sweeping frock coat that reached his calves, the collar lined with the fur of something white and feral. His hair was the color of a winter eclipse, dark, with streaks of silver that caught the dim light of the gas lamps. But it was his eyes that stopped her heart. They weren't the pale blue or muddy brown of the locals. They were the color of a dying star, burning violet, rimmed with a ring of molten gold. He was a vampire, and not just any vampire. The aura of power that radiated from him was so thick it felt like physical pressure against her chest. "Go away," Estelle rasped, her voice breaking. "I have no blood worth taking. I am mostly ice and bitterness now." The man tilted his head, a graceful, predatory movement. He knelt in the slush, heedless of his expensive clothes. Up close, his skin was the color of fine marble, and he was so handsome it was painful to look at him. He looked like a god of the underworld who had lost his way. "I did not come to feed, little bird," he said softly. He reached out a hand. His fingers were long and elegant, his nails trimmed to perfection. He didn't touch her. Not yet. He just hovered his hand near her cheek, and Estelle felt a sudden, terrifying jolt of heat. It was as if he were a living hearth. Who are you?" she whispered, her consciousness slipping. "A man who recognizes a diamond in a gutter," he replied. He looked at her tattered maid's uniform, the stain on her apron, the way her small hands were curled like dead leaves. Then he did something that the city of Rosehaven would have considered a sin. He reached down and tucked a strand of frozen hair behind her ear. His touch was electric. "Sleep now, Estelle Stonewell," he murmured. "The street is no longer your master." As the darkness finally claimed her, she felt herself being lifted. She expected the cold grip of a corpse, but instead, she was enveloped in a warmth so profound it felt like a summer afternoon. She felt the steady, slow rhythm of a heart that beat once for every 10 of hers, and the scent of cedar and wine carried her away into the deep. Alistair Whitlock, the king of Rosehaven and the sovereign of the Shadowfell, was not a man given to impulse. For 400 years, his life had been a series of calculated moves, treaties signed in blood, wars fought in the silence of the mind, and the heavy, unending duty of maintaining the veil between the living and the eternal. He had been leaving the opera early, bored by the predictable tragedies on stage when he had seen her. She had been a speck of grey against the white of the storm. Most would have seen a beggar. Alistair had seen a soul that was burning so brightly in its final moments that it had pierced through his apathy. He had seen the way she held herself. Even in collapse, there was a dignity in the set of her shoulders that spoke of a spirit that had fought until the very last spark. His carriage, a massive obsidian construct drawn by 4 nightmare stallions, sat idling at the end of the alley. His equerry, Sebastian Hollowhall, stood by the open door, his expression one of polite, masked disdain. "Sire," Sebastian said, as Alistair emerged from the shadows of the alley, carrying the unconscious girl in his arms. "The council is waiting. The blood tax negotiations. The council can wait until the moon turns to ash," Alistair said, his voice dropping an octave. Sebastian's eyes widened as he looked at the girl. She was filthy. Her clothes were rags, her face was smeared with soot and frozen tears, and she smelled of the damp, rot-choked streets of the lower district. "You intend to bring that into the carriage?" Sebastian asked, his voice trembling slightly. Alistair stopped. He didn't look at Sebastian. He looked down at the girl. Her head had fallen against his shoulder, and a faint, rhythmic puff of her breath, warm and fragile, was hitting the skin of his neck. It was the most vital thing he had felt in a century. "She is not a that, Sebastian," Alistair said. "She is the only honest thing I have seen in this city tonight. Open the door." The interior of the carriage was a sanctuary of crushed velvet and dark mahogany. Alistair settled onto the bench, keeping the girl cradled against his chest. He pulled a heavy sable robe from the seat across from him and wrapped it around her, tucking it tight until only her pale, hollow-cheeked face was visible. The carriage lurched forward, the horse's hooves striking sparks against the cobblestones. Alistair watched her. As a vampire, he could see the map of her life written in the scent of her blood. He could smell the poverty, yes, but beneath it he smelled the iron of her resolve, the sweetness of her youth, and a strange floral note, like roses blooming in a graveyard. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Her skin was starting to thaw, turning from a deathly grey to a faint, translucent pink. "Why did they let you fall, Estelle?" he whispered to the empty carriage. He knew her name because he had seen the small, brass name tag pinned to her tattered bodice. E. Stonewell, Mistwood Manor. He knew the Mistwoods. They were a family of bloated aristocrats who valued their horses more than their humans. To think they had cast this girl out into a winter like this. The carriage began the long ascent toward the Whitlock Citadel, the fortress that sat atop the highest peak of Rosehaven. As they climbed, the air grew thinner and colder, but inside the carriage, the heat was stifling. Alistair found himself leaning down, his nose inches from the pulse point in her neck. He could hear it. Thump, 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 thump. The frantic, fluttering beat of a trapped bird. His fangs pricked the inside of his lip, the ancient hunger stirred by her proximity. Her blood would be pure. It would be life itself. But he didn't bite. Instead, he rested his forehead against hers. "I am a monster, little maid," he murmured. "But even monsters have a sense of debt. You have reminded me what it feels like to want to protect something. For that, I owe you a life." The carriage passed through the iron gates of the citadel, the gargoyles on the gateposts bowing their heads as the king returned. The servants, vampires of lesser lineage and high-blood humans, lined the courtyard, their eyes fixed on the ground. When the carriage door opened, a collective gasp rippled through the gathered staff. The King of Rosehaven stepped out, carrying a human girl draped in his own royal furs. He didn't hand her to a footman. He didn't call for a physician to take her to the infirmary. He carried her toward the great stairs, toward his private wing, the wing where no human had set foot in 300 years. "Sire!" a woman called out. It was Ottavia Mistwood, a distant cousin of the family Estelle had served, who had been waiting to petition the king for a land grant. She stared at Estelle with horror. "That girl! She was a maid in my household. She was dismissed for thievery and insolence. You cannot bring such filth into the—" Alistair stopped. He didn't turn around. He simply let the temperature in the courtyard drop 20 degrees. The fountains froze mid-splash. "Ottavia," Alistair said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "If you ever speak of this woman as filth again, I will ensure your lineage ends tonight. She is under my shadow now, and my shadow is very, very long." He continued up the stairs, leaving the court in a stunned, frozen silence. Inside the heat of the castle, the scent of Estelle's warming body began to fill his senses. She stirred in his arms, a small moan escaping her lips. Her hand, small and scarred from years of hard labor, reached out and clutched the lapel of his coat. She didn't wake, but she clung to him, as if he were the only solid thing in a world of water. Alistair reached his private chambers, a sprawling suite of black marble and starlight-coloured silks. He laid her down on his bed, a massive four-poster draped in midnight blue. He stood back, his hands trembling slightly. He had done the unthinkable. He had brought a dying human into the heart of the vampire monarchy. He had challenged his court for a girl who possessed nothing but her breath. And as he watched her chest rise and fall in the soft glow of the fireplace, he realized with a start that for the first time in centuries, he wasn't bored. He was terrified. The first thing Estelle felt was the smell. It was not the smell of damp wool or horse manure or the metallic tang of the city. It was the smell of lilies and old books and the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke. She opened her eyes and immediately closed them. The light was too soft, too golden. She was dead. She had to be. This was the afterlife her mother had talked about, a place of warmth and silence. "You are not dead, though I suspect you gave the Reaper a very difficult time," a voice said. Estelle's eyes flew open. She was lying in a bed so large she felt like a doll. The sheets beneath her were silk, actual, genuine silk, and the blankets were made of a fur so soft it felt like a cloud. She sat up, her head spinning. She was no longer wearing her tattered maid's uniform. She was dressed in a nightgown of white linen, its sleeves edged in delicate lace. Her skin was clean, her hair brushed and smelling of lavender. Panic flared in her chest. She looked around the room. It was a cathedral of shadows. High vaulted ceilings, tapestries that depicted ancient battles, and a fireplace large enough to roast an ox. And sitting in a high-backed chair by the fire was him. The man from the alley. The Vampire King. He was reading a book, his long legs crossed at the knee. He looked different in the firelight, less like a predator and more like a scholar, but the power still rolled off him in waves. "Where am I?" she whispered. "The Whitlock Citadel," he said, not looking up from his page. "Specifically my bedchamber. You have been asleep for 36 hours. Estelle's hands flew to her throat. "My clothes. Who changed me?" Alistair finally looked up. His violet eyes seemed to glow in the dim light. "My house staff, under the supervision of my head healer, Guinevere. I assure you, your modesty was respected. Although Guinevere was quite distressed by the state of your malnutrition." Estelle pulled the blankets up to her chin. Why did you bring me here? You're the king." "I am Alistair," he said, closing the book. He stood up and walked toward the bed. Every step was silent, as if he didn't quite touch the floor. "And I brought you here because I was curious if a heart that fought so hard to beat in the cold would continue to do so in the warmth." He stopped a few feet from the bed. "You were a maid at Mistwood, were you not?" Estelle looked down at her hands. They were clean, the dirt scrubbed from under her nails, but the calluses were still there. "I was, until I wasn't." "They say you were a thief," Alistair said softly. "They lie," Estelle snapped, the fire returning to her eyes. "Lord Mistwood's son couldn't take no for an answer, so he decided to take my reputation instead. It was cheaper than a conscience." Alistair's expression didn't change, but the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to lengthen. "I thought as much. The Mistwoods have always been a creative family when it comes to the truth." He reached into the pocket of his waistcoat and pulled out a small silver tray. On it was a bowl of broth and a piece of dark buttered bread. He set it on the nightstand beside her. "Eat," he commanded. "Your body is a temple that has been looted. We must rebuild it." Estelle looked at the food, then back at him. People say your kind treats us like cattle. That we are just wine bottles waiting to be opened." Alistair leaned in, his face inches from hers. She could see the faint, intricate patterns of his irises. "Most of my kind do. I have lived a long time, Estelle. I have tasted the blood of queens and the blood of peasants. It all tastes like salt and iron in the end." He reached out and picked up the spoon, dipping it into the broth. He held it out to her. "But I did not save you to feed on you," he said. "I saved you because I wanted to see if someone could survive Rosehaven without becoming like the stone." Estelle hesitated, then leaned forward and took the soup from the spoon. It was rich, savory, and filled with a heat that seemed to spread through her veins like liquid gold. She let out a small, involuntary sob. "Thank you," she whispered. "Do not thank me yet," Alistair said, his voice turning somber. "By bringing you here, I have made you a target. My court does not like distractions, especially human ones." He stood up and walked to the massive floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over the city. Below, Rosehaven was a sea of flickering lights, beautiful and deadly. "The unthinkable is not that I saved you, Estelle," he said, his back to her. "The unthinkable is that I intend to keep you here. Not as a maid. Not as a servant." He turned back to her, his silhouette framed by the moonlight. "But as my guest. My ward. Let the city wonder why the king has chosen a beggar over a duchess." Estelle stared at him, the spoon trembling in her hand. "They will kill me." "They will have to go through me first," Alistair said. "And I am very, very difficult to get through." As Estelle finished her meal, her eyes grew heavy again. The warmth of the room and the fullness of her stomach were a sedative she couldn't fight. As she drifted back into sleep, she saw Alistair return to his chair. He didn't pick up his book. He simply sat there, his eyes fixed on her, a silent, eternal sentry against the world outside. She didn't know then that her survival was about to trigger a war. She only knew that for the first time in her life, she wasn't cold. As Estelle sleeps, a dark figure watches from the balcony. Sebastian Hollowhall, the king's equerry, whispering into a communication stone. "The king has succumbed to a mortal weakness. Initiate the plan." The sunlight in the Whitlock citadel was not the warm, golden embrace Estelle remembered from her childhood. Here, the sun filtered through panes of enchanted obsidian and stained glass, casting long, bruised shadows of violet and deep crimson across the floors. It was a filtered light, stripped of its heat, as if the very architecture of the fortress were designed to protect its inhabitants from the touch of the day. Estelle stood by the window of her new chambers, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings of the stone sill. She was no longer the girl in the gutter. She was draped in a gown of midnight blue velvet, the fabric so heavy and rich it felt like wearing a secret. Beneath it, her skin was no longer raw from the wind, but soft, treated with oils that smelled of winter jasmine. Yet, she felt like a ghost, haunting a palace. A soft knock at the door startled her. It wasn't the heavy rhythmic thud of the king's guard, but something lighter, almost hesitant. "Come in," Estelle said, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. Clearer, stronger than it had been in months. The door creaked open to reveal a woman with hair the color of spun silver and eyes that held the weary kindness of 1,000 years. She wore robes of moss-green silk and carried a tray of small crystal vials. This was Guinevere Eldamore, the king's primary healer, and one of the few who looked at Estelle without hunger or hatred. "You are looking more like yourself today, Estelle," Guinevere said, moving into the room with a grace that suggested her feet barely touched the rugs. She set the tray down on a small marble table. "The color has returned to your cheeks, though I suspect your heart is still wandering the streets of the lower district." Estelle turned from the window, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "It's hard to forget the cold when the walls are made of ice, Guinevere." "These walls are made of history," the healer corrected gently. "And Alistair, he is trying to ensure you are not just another footnote in it. He has asked me to begin your acclamation. There are things you must understand about this house if you are to survive the people within it. Guinevere began to explain the nature of the citadel. It was a living thing, bound to the Whitlock bloodline. The shadows moved not with the sun, but with the king's mood. But more importantly, she spoke of the high bloods, the ancient families who viewed Alistair's sudden interest in a human as a sign of decay. "Sebastian Hollowhall is the one you must watch," Guinevere whispered, her eyes darting toward the closed door. "He has been at Alistair's side for 3 centuries. He believes the king's mercy is a sickness that will infect us all. To him, you are the fever." Later that afternoon, Estelle was permitted to walk the glass-enclosed gardens of the upper tier. It was a labyrinth of white roses that only bloomed in the dark and silver-leafed trees that hummed when the wind hit them. As she walked, she felt a presence behind her. She didn't turn. She knew the scent now. Cedar and pomegranate wine. "You look as though you are planning an escape," Alistair said. He was leaning against a pillar of black marble, his arms crossed over his chest. He had discarded his formal coat, wearing only a white silk shirt unbuttoned at the throat. In the dim light of the garden, he looked less like a king and more like a man burdened by the weight of his own shadow. "Is it an escape, if I was brought here against my will?" Estelle asked, though the bite in her words was softened by the way her heart leapt at the sight of him. Alistair walked toward her, his movements fluid and silent. He stopped just inches away, and the air between them seemed to crackle with an invisible heat. "I saved your life, little bird. I did not realize I was also stealing your freedom." "The two are often the same for people like me," she replied, looking up at him. "In the city, I was free to die. Here, I am forced to live. I don't know which is more terrifying." Alistair reached out, his hand hovering near her waist before he pulled it back, as if remembering a boundary. "I want you to be safe, Estelle, but safety in this castle is a fragile thing. Tonight, the Council of 7 arrives. They have heard of the Maid who sleeps in the King's Wing. They will come with questions." "And what will you tell them?" Alistair's eyes turned a deep, burning violet. "I will tell them that I am the king, and that what I choose to keep under my shadow is no concern of those who live in the light." He turned to leave, but stopped. "Stay in your rooms tonight, Estelle. The Feast of Shadows is not for the faint of heart. Sebastian will be looking for a reason to prove I have lost my way. Do not give him one." As he vanished into the gloom of the corridor, Estelle felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the winter. She looked down at her hands, the calluses fading, but the memories of the struggle still etched into her bones. She wasn't just a guest. She was a piece on a chessboard she didn't understand. Soft cliffhanger. As she returned to her room, Estelle found a small, dead white rose pinned to her door with a silver needle. Attached was a note in a sharp, elegant hand. "The king's shadow is long, but it cannot hide the scent of mortality. Enjoy the warmth while it lasts, thief." The library of the Whitlock Citadel was a cathedral of forgotten knowledge. Thousands of leather-bound volumes lined the walls, rising up into the darkness of the vaulted ceiling. The only light came from the massive hearth and a few stray ghost lanterns that floated through the aisles, their blue flames flickering like captured spirits. Estelle had found the library 3 days after the warning on her door. She couldn't stay in her room any longer. The silence was beginning to taste like ash. She sought refuge among the books, hoping to find some hint of the man who had pulled her from the snow. She was sitting in a high-backed velvet chair, a heavy tome on the history of the Shadowfell open on her lap, when the shadows in the corner of the room began to knit together. Alistair stepped out of the darkness. He looked exhausted. The pale marble of his skin seemed almost translucent, and there were dark circles beneath his eyes that spoke of nights spent in battle, perhaps not with swords, but with words and wills. You have a fondness for the dead, I see, he said, nodding toward her book. The dead don't leave notes on my door, Estelle replied, closing the book. Why do they hate you, Alistair? Your own people. Alistair sat on the edge of a massive oak table, looking into the fire. They do not hate me. They fear the vacuum I would leave if I were to fall. And they hate the reminder that I was once like them, driven by hunger, by the need to dominate. They want a god, not a man who remembers what it feels like to be cold. He looked at her, and for the first time the king's mask slipped. He looked profoundly lonely. The Whitlock line is cursed, Estelle. We are the keepers of the Shadowfell, the source of the magic that sustains Rosehaven. But the magic requires a price. For every century I rule, a piece of my humanity is consumed. My heart beats slower. My blood grows colder. Eventually, I will become like the stone of this castle, eternal, but empty. Estelle stood up and walked toward him. She felt a strange, magnetic pull, a need to bridge the distance between his immortality and her fleeting life. Is that why you saved me? To see if you could still feel something other than the curse? Alistair didn't look away. I saved you because I saw a girl who refused to let the world break her. I saw a reflection of the man I used to be before the crown was forged in my blood. He reached out, and this time he didn't pull back. His fingers brushed against the pulse point in her wrist. The contact was like a bolt of lightning. Estelle's breath hitched. She could feel the coolness of his skin, but beneath it there was a vibration, a low hum of power that made her vision swim. Your heart, he whispered, his thumb tracing the rhythmic thrum of her blood. It is so fast, so fragile, like a drum beating out a countdown. Does it make you hungry? She asked, her voice a mere breath. Alistair leaned closer. He was so near she could see the faint, silvery veins in his irises. The scent of him, wood smoke and ancient forests, enveloped her. It makes me want to stop the clock, he murmured. It makes me want to hold the sun in my hands, just to keep you warm for one more hour. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. It wasn't a kiss, but it was an intimacy more profound than anything Estelle had ever known. In that moment, the king and the maid vanished. There were only two souls, one ancient and one new, clinging to each other in the dark. I cannot love you, Estelle, he whispered against her skin. To love a human is to invite the shadows to feed on her. I am the king of the dead, and everything I touch eventually turns to dust. Then let me be dust, she whispered back, her hand rising to touch the cold silk of his hair. I would rather be a handful of ash in your hands than a whole woman in a world that doesn't see me. Alistair let out a sound that was half groan, half sob. He pulled away abruptly, the shadows in the room swirling violently as his control wavered. Go to your rooms, Estelle, he said, his voice regaining its kingly iron. The Feast of Shadows is tomorrow. Sebastian has arranged a tribute for the council. He will try to use you to shame me. Stay hidden. If you value your life, do not leave the wing. He vanished before she could respond, leaving the library cold and silent once more. Soft cliffhanger. As Estelle hurried back to her quarters, she passed a mirror in the hallway. For a split second, her reflection didn't show her own face, but that of a woman with hollow eyes and a throat gashed red, a warning from the castle itself. The grand ballroom of the Whitlock Citadel was a cavern of obsidian and moonlight. Huge chandeliers made of frozen tears hung from the ceiling, their light shifting from pale blue to a sickly violet. The nobility of Rosehaven, vampires dressed in silks that shimmered like oil on water, moved through the space with the predatory grace of sharks in a dark sea. Estelle watched from the shadows of the mezzanine gallery. She had ignored Alistair's warning. She couldn't stay in her room while the city's wolves gathered to discuss her fate. She wore a dress of crimson silk, a colour that screamed of life and blood, that she had found in the back of the wardrobe, a relic of some long-forgotten queen. Down on the floor, Alistair sat upon the shadow throne. He looked magnificent and terrible, a crown of black iron resting on his brow. Beside him stood Sebastian Hollowhall, looking smug and lethal in a suit of charcoal grey. "The tribute," Sebastian's voice rang out, cutting through the low hum of the crowd. 4 guards entered the room, dragging a heavy iron cage. Inside was a creature that made Estelle's stomach turn, a feral, a vampire who had lost its mind to the hunger, its skin grey and peeling, its eyes glowing with a mindless, starving light. "Our king has shown a peculiar interest in the lower forms of life recently," Sebastian said, his eyes scanning the mezzanine until they locked onto Estelle's hiding spot. A cruel smile touched his lips. "He believes that mercy can bridge the gap between the eternal and the ephemeral. Perhaps he would like to demonstrate this mercy now, by feeding this creature, a soul that is already half lost." The crowd went silent. Alistair stood up, his hand moving to the hilt of the black sword at his hip. "Enough, Sebastian. This is not a circus." "Is it not?" Sebastian countered. "You bring a beggar into the royal wing. You feed her from your own table. You whisper to her in the library while the blood tax goes uncollected. You have made us a laughing stock among the Shadowfell." Sebastian signalled to the guards. They began to unbolt the cage. "No!" Estelle cried out, her voice echoing through the ballroom. She stepped out into the light of the mezzanine, her red dress flaring like a flame. Alistair looked up, his expression a mixture of fury and terror. "Estelle, get back!" But it was too late. Sebastian moved with a speed no human could follow. He was on the mezzanine in the blink of an eye, his hand gripping Estelle's throat, his fingers like iron battens. He held her over the railing, her feet dangling over the ballroom floor, where the feral roared in its cage. "See how she trembles," Sebastian hissed to the crowd. "See how the Queen of Rags weeps for her life. This is the weakness Alistair invites into our house." Alistair was already moving, a blur of shadow and steel, but Sebastian pressed a silver dagger to Estelle's side. "One more step, sire, and I'll see if her blood is truly as sweet as you think." Estelle looked down at Alistair. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but she didn't scream. She saw the agony in his eyes. The king who could move mountains, but couldn't save the one thing that made him feel human. "Do it, Alistair," she rasped, looking past Sebastian at the king. "Don't let him use me to break you." Sebastian laughed, a cold, dry sound. How romantic, a sacrifice for a crown that is already cracked. But Sebastian had underestimated one thing. He had forgotten that Estelle Stonewell was a girl who had survived the streets of Rosehaven. She reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out the silver needle she had found on her door, the one that had held the dead rose. With every ounce of strength she had left, she drove the needle into Sebastian's eye. The vampire let out a shriek of inhuman pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. Estelle plummeted. She felt the rush of cold air, the blurred faces of the horrified nobility, and the snapping jaws of the feral below. But before she hit the floor, a pair of arms caught her, arms as strong as the foundations of the world, and as warm as a summer hearth. Alistair held her against his chest, his cloak billowing around them like a protective wing. He looked down at her, his eyes no longer violet, but a terrifying, incandescent gold. "I told you to stay in your room," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I've never been very good at following orders," she gasped. Alistair turned his gaze to the mezzanine, where Sebastian was clutching his face, blood, black and thick, seeping between his fingers. The king's aura expanded, snuffing out every candle in the ballroom. The darkness was absolute, heavy, and filled with the sound of 1,000 screaming whispers. "The feast is over," Alistair's voice boomed, vibrating in the very bones of the guests. "And the execution of Sebastian Hollowhall has begun." As the darkness settles, a new sound emerges, the heavy thud of the citadel's outer gates being smashed open. Not by vampires, but by the iron-shod boots of an army from the surface, led by the very Lord Mistwood who had cast Estelle out, now carrying torches and silver-tipped spears. The sound of the outer gates buckling was a low, seismic groan that vibrated through the very foundations of the Whitlock citadel. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world of hushed whispers and velvet shadows. It was the sound of iron, of fire, and of human rage. Alistair stood in the centre of the grand ballroom, his arms still wrapped around Estelle. The darkness he had unleashed to cow his court remained coiled around them like a protective shroud, but the air was now tainted. The sweet scent of pomegranate wine and cedar was being choked out by the sharp, acrid smell of burning pitch and the metallic tang of silver. "They are here," Estelle whispered, her fingers digging into the silk of Alistair's sleeves. She knew that sound. She had heard it in the stories told in the lower districts, the sound of the purge, the rare moments when the humans of Rosehaven gathered enough desperate courage to strike at the heights. "Lord Mistwood," Alistair said, his voice a low vibration against her chest. He didn't sound surprised. He sounded weary, as if this were a play he had seen performed a dozen times over the centuries. "He uses your disappearance as a pretext, but he seeks the Shadowfell. He thinks that by burning the mountain, he can claim the sun." The ballroom was in chaos. The vampire nobility, usually so composed and predatory, was scattering like crows. Some vanished into the upper spires, while others, driven by ancient instincts, bared their fangs and prepared for a slaughter. "Alistair, you have to let me go," Estelle said, pulling back to look into his glowing gold eyes. "If I go to them, if I tell them I came here of my own will, maybe they'll stop. You would go back to the man who cast you into the snow." Alistair's grip tightened, not in aggression, but in a sudden, fierce possessiveness. "You would return to the gutter to save a castle that has done nothing but sneer at you?" "I would do it to save you," she replied. Alistair let out a short, harsh laugh. He reached up, his cold thumb tracing the line of her throat where Sebastian's marks were already beginning to fade. "Estelle, look around you. This castle is a tomb. I have been its headstone for 400 years. You are the only living thing within these walls. I will not trade the sun for more darkness." The doors at the far end of the ballroom burst open. A wave of soldiers in heavy, silver-plated armour poured in, led by a man in a coat of fox fur. Lord Mistwood. He carried a torch in one hand and a silver-tipped crossbow in the other. His face, once handsome in a bloated, aristocratic way, was twisted with a frantic kind of greed. "Whitlock!" Mistwood bellowed, his voice echoing off the obsidian pillars. "Release the girl and surrender the heart of the citadel, and we might leave your kind enough ash to bury." Alistair stepped forward, shielding Estelle with his body. The shadows around him began to take shape, manifesting as jagged, ethereal blades. "You stand in the house of Whitlock, little lord. You speak of ash while standing in a furnace." "I speak for the people of Rosehaven," Mistwood countered, though his eyes darted toward the massive gems embedded in the walls. "We are tired of paying the blood tax. We are tired of your shadow." "You are tired of your own insignificance," Alistair said. The battle began not with a word, but with the hiss of a silver bolt. It streaked through the air, aimed directly at Alistair's heart. He didn't move, but the shadows intercepted it, the silver sizzling and evaporating before it could touch him. "Guinevere!" Alistair shouted over the roar of the fire as the humans began to toss torches onto the tapestries. The healer appeared from a side door, her silver hair flowing behind her like a banner. She looked at the carnage with a profound sadness. "Take her to the inner sanctum," Alistair commanded. "To the heart." If the citadel falls, the heart must be extinguished. Do not let them take it." "Alistair, no!" Estelle cried as Guinevere took her arm. "Go, Estelle," Alistair said, turning his back to her to face the advancing line of silver. "I did the unthinkable when I brought you here. Now I must do the impossible to keep you." As Guinevere pulled her toward the secret passages behind the throne, Estelle looked back one last time. She saw Alistair, the vampire king who had seen her sleeping on the street, standing alone against a sea of fire and silver, a god of the night refusing to let the dawn take his treasure. Soft cliffhanger. As the secret door closed, Estelle heard a sickening thud, the sound of Alistair's sword meeting silver, and the scream of a man who realized he had hunted a predator he couldn't kill. The inner sanctum was a place where time seemed to fold in on itself. It was a circular chamber deep within the mountain, the walls made of raw, pulsing obsidian that hummed with a low, rhythmic frequency. In the center, floating above a pool of liquid starlight, was the heart of the Shadowfell, a massive, multifaceted crystal that glowed with a deep, throbbing violet light. This was the source of the vampire's immortality, the anchor that kept the citadel tethered to the world. And it was dying. "It mirrors him," Guinevere whispered, standing at the edge of the pool. Her reflection in the starlight looked ancient, her eyes filled with the wisdom of the earth. As Alistair's resolve wavers, the heart dims. He is fighting for you, Estelle, but every drop of blood he spills for a human draws him closer to the feral state. Estelle walked to the edge of the water. She could feel the power of the crystal. It felt like the first breath of winter, sharp and invigorating. How do we stop it? How do we save him? "The curse of the Whitlock line is a loop," Guinevere explained, her voice echoing in the chamber. "The king must be cold to keep the magic. To love is to bring heat, and heat shatters the obsidian. If he continues to fight with love in his heart, the crystal will shatter, the citadel will crumble, and every vampire tied to this place will turn to dust." "And if he stops loving?" Estelle asked, her voice trembling. "Then he becomes the monster Mistwood claims he is. He will slaughter them all, and you will be just another trophy in a hall of ghosts." The chamber doors shook. The humans had found the path. The scent of silver was stronger now, a biting, metallic odor that seemed to make the very air bleed. "There is a third way," Guinevere said, her eyes fixing on Estelle. "But it requires a sacrifice that no king has ever dared to ask, and no maid has ever dared to give." "Tell me," Estelle said, her voice steady. "The magic needs a vessel that isn't cursed by the past, a heart that isn't tired. You are human, Estelle. Your blood is the only thing that can stabilize the Shadowfell without being consumed by it. If you offer your life to the heart, not as a victim, but as a guardian, the curse is broken. Alistair will be free, but he will be mortal. He would live? He would live, Guinevere confirmed, as a man, without the crown, without the shadow. And you would become the spirit of the mountain. You would be the light that guides Rosehaven, but you would never touch him again." A sudden explosion rocked the room. The obsidian walls cracked, and the violet light of the crystal flared into a blinding white. Sebastian Hollowhall stepped through the smoke. He was a nightmare to behold. One side of his face was a ruin of black gore where Estelle had blinded him, and his eyes were wide with a manic, starving light. He had survived the king's execution, fueled by a hatred that had transcended his loyalty. "The maid and the healer," Sebastian hissed, his voice a wet rattle. "The king is busy playing hero in the ballroom. He won't be here to catch you this time." He lunged across the chamber, his movements jagged and wrong. Guinevere raised her hands, weaving a shield of moss-green light, but Sebastian tore through it with a strength born of madness. He grabbed Estelle by the hair, dragging her toward the pool of starlight. If the king wants a human so badly, let him see what happens when she becomes part of the machine. Estelle fought, her nails clawing at Sebastian's cold, dead flesh. But as she looked into the pulsing violet of the heart, she didn't see a prison. She saw a way out. She saw a future where Alistair didn't have to be a monster. "Alistair!" she screamed, her voice tearing through the mountain. The air in the room suddenly went dead silent. The shadows on the walls froze. Alistair Whitlock didn't walk into the room. He exploded into it. He was covered in silver burns, his clothes shredded, his black sword dripping with the blood of men. He looked like death itself come to claim its due. "Release her, Sebastian," Alistair said. His voice wasn't a rumble anymore. It was the sound of the earth splitting open. "Or what, sire?" Sebastian laughed, holding his dagger to Estelle's heart. "You'll kill me again? I'm already dead. We're all dead. You just haven't realized it yet." Sebastian pulled Estelle closer to the edge. "Watch, King. Watch your humanity die." Soft cliffhanger. As Sebastian prepared to thrust the blade, Estelle didn't pull away. She leaned into the crystal's aura, her hand reaching out to touch the heart. The moment her skin met the violet light, the entire citadel let out a scream of pure, incandescent power. The world turned white. It wasn't the white of the snow on the streets of Rosehaven, but a brilliant, searing light that stripped away the shadows and the secrets. Estelle felt a sensation of infinite expansion. The pain of Sebastian's grip, the cold of the mountain, the fear of the siege, all of it vanished, replaced by a profound, humming peace. She saw Alistair, not as the vampire king, but as the man he had been 400 years ago, a soldier with tired eyes and a heart that just wanted to protect his people. She saw the moment he had seen her in the alley, the spark of recognition that had bridged the gap between their worlds. The unthinkable, she realized, wasn't the mercy. It was the hope. She pushed back against Sebastian, her body acting as a conductor for the heart's energy. The traitorous equerry didn't even have time to scream. The light consumed him, turning his centuries of bitterness into a handful of grey ash that scattered into the pool of starlight. Then the energy turned toward Alistair. He stood at the edge of the light, his sword falling from his hand. He watched as the violet glow began to seep into his skin, dissolving the black veins of the curse, smoothing the marble-like hardness of his features. He was changing. The immortality was sloughing off him like a heavy, rusted armor. "Estelle," he called out, his voice sounding different, warmer, more resonant. "Stop, you're giving too much." "I'm giving enough," she whispered into his mind. She could feel herself fading, becoming a part of the obsidian, a part of the wind that blew through the spires. But she didn't care. If this was the price for his life, it was the cheapest bargain she had ever made. But Alistair wouldn't let her go. He dived into the pool of starlight, his human arms reaching for her as she began to dissolve into the light. He didn't use the power of a king. He used the desperation of a man. He grabbed her hand, his warm fingers interlocking with hers, and he pulled. "I didn't save you to lose you to a crystal, Estelle Stonewell," he roared. The heart of the Shadowfell reached its limit. With a sound like 1,000 bells shattering at once, the crystal exploded. The shockwave leveled the inner sanctum, sending the human soldiers in the ballroom flying and bringing the great obsidian towers of the citadel crashing down. The magic that had sustained the vampire monarchy for centuries evaporated in a single golden heartbeat. Silence fell over Rosehaven. The fires in the ballroom died out. The vampires who had survived the siege felt a sudden, terrifying weight, the weight of time. Some aged centuries in seconds, turning to dust in their fine silks. Others, the younger ones, simply fell to their knees, their fangs retracting, their eyes turning human for the first time in their lives. In the ruins of the inner sanctum, the dust settled slowly. Estelle opened her eyes. She was lying on a bed of raw earth and shattered obsidian. The ceiling of the mountain had collapsed, and for the first time in the history of the citadel, she could see the sky. It was dawn. The sun was rising over the spires of Rosehaven, casting a pale, pink light over the ruins. It didn't burn. It didn't sear. It was just light. Beside her, a man was stirring. He was dressed in rags that had once been a king's finery. His hair was dark, but the silver streaks were gone. His skin was tanned by the rising sun, and when he opened his eyes, they weren't violet or gold. They were a deep, soulful brown. Alistair looked at his hands. He could see the faint blue of his veins. He could feel the cold morning air on his skin. He reached up and touched his chest. Thump, 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 thump. He looked at Estelle, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across his face. A smile that held no shadow, no hunger, and no crown. "You're warm," he whispered, reaching out to touch her cheek. "And you're alive," she replied, her eyes filling with tears of joy. They were no longer the king and the maid. They were two survivors of a city that had tried to break them, standing in the ruins of a world that had tried to keep them apart. Alistair stood up, offering his hand to her. It was a hand scarred by the battle, but it was steady and full of heat. "The citadel is gone, Estelle. Rosehaven will have to find a new way to live." "And us?" she asked, taking his hand. Alistair looked out at the horizon, where the sun was fully breaking over the world. "We are going to find a place where the winter doesn't last forever. A place where a man can see a woman sleeping, and the only unthinkable thing he does is love her for the rest of his days." They walked out of the ruins together, their silhouettes disappearing into the golden light of a new day, leaving the shadows of Rosehaven behind them forever. Conclusion. The story of the Vampire King and his maid became a legend in the rebuilt streets of Rosehaven, a tale told to remind the citizens that even the heaviest chains of destiny can be broken by a single act of selfless mercy. Alistair and Estelle were never seen in the city again, but some say that if you travel far enough south to where the roses bloom in the sunlight and the wind smells of salt and rosemary, you might find a small cottage with a garden of white flowers that never fade. There, a man and a woman live a life that defies both crown and curse, proving that the greatest power in any world is not the blood we take, but the love we choose to give. They are free, they are fated, and they are finally, blissfully warm. If this story moved your heart, please like, share, and subscribe for more epic tales of love that defies the dark. Comment below with your favorite moment. Was it the king's first act of mercy, or the final choice that set them both free? Your support keeps the stories alive.